Alrighty, scholars, let's go ahead. We're going to continue with our lesson today. We're going to be talking about the era of reform. So this was a time period when a ton of changes were made to American society, and a lot of these reforms were led by women, which kind of goes on with the theme of March being Women's History Month. So we'll be talking a lot about women this month in particular, as we talked about in our last lesson with pioneer women. And today we're going to be focusing on women and as they lead an era of reform. So our objective is going to be able to explain to what extent did the reform movements of the mid-1800s improve life for Americans. All right, let's go ahead and get started with our intro. In 1851, people gathered in a church in Ohio to discuss the rights of women. A tall African-American woman named Sojourner Truth joined the crowd. As a former slave, Truth had learned to pay attention to white people, and now she listened as whites discussed whether women should have the same rights as men. Truth heard one speaker after another explain that women didn't need more rights because they weren't smart or strong enough to do much besides raise children. Women, they argued, needed help from men, and one man summed it up by saying, "Women are weak." Truth had heard enough. She rose slowly to her feet and walked to the pulpit. The room grew quiet as everyone waited for her to speak. "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere," she began. "Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or give me any best place." Her voice rose to a thunderous pitch. "And I ain't a woman. Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could outdo me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold into slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" When she finished, people applauded. Some cried. Sojourner Truth represented two great reform movements in America in the 1800s, the movement for women's equality and the movement to end slavery. Between about 1820 and 1850, many Americans devoted themselves to these causes, as well as to improving education. In this lesson, you will learn to what extent these reform movements improved life for Americans. All right, we're going to start the spirit of reform. It was fitting that the meeting attended by Sojourner Truth took place in a church. New religious movements played a key role in inspiring thousands of Americans to try to reform or fix society. The Second Great Awakening. A revival of religious feeling, which church leaders called the Second Great Awakening, swept across the nation from the 1800s to the 1840s. Day after day, people gathered in churches and big white tents to hear messages of hope. Preachers like Charles G. Finley, a leader of the movement, urged Christians to let themselves be filled with the Spirit of God. Their listeners prayed, shouted, sang hymns, and sometimes even cried for hours or fell down in frenzies. And you can see kind of some people looking like they're falling and crying over here. Although this new movement appealed to people's emotions, like the Great Awakening did during the 1730s and 1740s, this religious revival offered something new. In the past, most Christian ministers had said that God had already decided who would be saved. But now, many preachers said everyone could gain forgiveness for their sins. Many of them taught that doing good works could help them to be saved. So this optimistic message attracted enthusiastic followers throughout the West and North, and gave men and women alike a reason to work for the improvement of society. Charles Finley's preaching, for example, inspired many people to oppose slavery. So what this chapter is saying is that a lot of reasons why Americans wanted to reform society or change society It's because of the Second Great Awakening, this religious movement that said, hey, even though you've done some bad things in your past, you can fix your past and get into heaven by doing good things now. So a lot of people turned to doing good things by reforming society, whether that is giving women rights, trying to end slavery, as we're going to see, educational reform, prison reform, all these types of societal reforms to try to make society and the world a better place to live in. All right, optimistic ideas. Other optimistic ideas also inspired Americans during this time. In New England, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a former minister, was a central figure in a movement called Transcendentalism. Emerson believed that every human being has unlimited potential, but in order to realize their godlike nature, people have to transcend or go beyond purely logical thinking. And this is what Transcendentalism is. They can find the answers to life's mysteries only by learning to trust their emotions and intuition, right? That gut feeling that you have. Transcendentalists added to the spirit of reform by urging people to question society's rules and institutions. Do not conform to others' expectations, which means do not fall into, do not believe just because others believe it. They said, if you want to find God and your own true self, look to nature and the God within. Emerson's friend, Henry David Thoreau, captured this new individualism in a famous essay. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, wrote Thoreau, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, which saying it's okay for people to be different than others, right? Everybody should kind of march to the beat of their own drum, which is what Henry David Thoreau is saying here in this speech. In 1845, Thoreau demonstrated what he practiced. Demonstrated that he practiced what he preached. When he went into the woods near Concord, Massachusetts, to live alone and as close as nature as possible. And David Thoreau spent more than 2 years in solitude, living in the woods with very minimal human contact. And he's going to record his 2-year experience in the 6,000-page journal. And in 1846, he was thrown in jail for refusing to pay taxes because he was really against the Mexican-American War and didn't want to pay for that war. And his journal is going to be published into this book known as Walden because he lived near Lake Walden, also known as Life in the Woods. Highly recommend reading this book at some point. It was one of my favorite books when I was in high school and in early college. All right, let's keep going. Model communities. While Thoreau tried to find the ideal life in solitude, other transcendentalists tried to create ideal communities. In 1841, George Ripley started a community called Brook Farm near Boston, and residents at Brook Farm tried to live in brotherly cooperation. Instead of competing with each other as people in the larger society did, they shared the labor of supporting themselves by farming, teaching, and making clothes. Brook Farm was only one of hundreds of model communities started by reformers in the first half of the 1800s. While most of these experiments lasted only a few years, they were a powerful expression of the belief that people of goodwill could create an ideal society. And these communities, today known as communes, there's still a good amount today throughout the United States, but not on a huge, large scale. Alrighty, scholars, on the next cycle, you're going to be answering some questions about the reading that we have done. This is the end of the video. Advisors, you can go ahead and move on to the next slide.